68's bracket show, Fielding the 68. I'm Kai McKeon. I am your host for what I think is the best bracket episode of all time prior to Selection Sunday. And I have two of the very best bracketologists with me, helping me sort through the bracket. We got Rocco Miller. We got Andy Bottoms. And fellas, we're going to talk about who is in the current field as of today. We've seen tons of craziness during this championship week. We've seen bubble teams win, go on runs. We've seen bubble teams lose in the first round and blow their opportunity potentially for the field. We will talk about that in detail. But first, I want to start off with a question for you fellas. Because we've seen so much turmoil in these conference tournaments, I have seen several people on Twitter mention, oh, this team's out, this team's in. Knee-jerk reactions to these one-game sample sizes in conference tournaments. Rocco, you mentioned, I believe last week on our show, that the committee is already planning out the field of 68 as we speak. They already have an idea. So how impactful are these losses? How far can they swing a team out into the field?
Yeah, Kai, I think it really depends on what team you're talking about. I think middle of the pack teams are pretty solid. You know, I think the committee arrived and it met in New Orleans Tuesday night, started meeting Wednesday. So this is their third full day of meetings. And what I've learned over the last few years is for the most part, everything should be wrapped up by tomorrow afternoon. So if there's not anything really outlandish, you know, between now and then, you know, most of the work's done. They've done most of the balloting. I think that takes care of a lot of the seeding, and then scrubbing will happen after the fact. And that's going to start probably tonight. And then in terms of selection, you know, with the bubble last few spots, there's a bunch of bid stealers still out there and, you know, hanging on to dear life. You know, they got to pay attention to that and put contingencies together for them. But by and large, you know, out of the 36 at-large teams, there's probably agreement on at least, I would say, 32 by the end of tonight, if not more.
So, Andy, anything to add to that? Your Indiana Hoosiers are going on quite a run right now. Perhaps they've played into the field currently. We'll talk about the bubble soon, but anything to add to that conference tournament discussion?
Yeah, I mean, IU clearly a 9 seed at this point. I think we can all agree on that. No, it is kind of funny because we did a post-game show after the game today, and I feel like I'm kind of throwing cold water on everybody where you're like, oh, they're jumping this, they're definitely safe, they're whatever. They definitely have a little bit of breathing room that they didn't have coming into today. But so long as you're taking the committee at their word that it is truly the full body of work, this is like, you know, every game is 3% of the resume. So how much could you really jump up the seed list in that scenario? So right. It matters to the people on the margins who are very close to the cut line where a spot or two means a lot. But to Rocco's point, when you get into the middle, you know, if you're you might jump from the first 7 to the last 6. And so that might look like, hey, one win meant a lot, but you might have only moved one spot on the overall seed list. So I think it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of it. I mean, we all do. We love college basketball, so I get it. But yeah, for us, it's trying to take a step back and figure out how it just fits into the overall picture as opposed to being too much a prisoner of the moment.
Yeah, and the non-college basketball diehards out there, you know, they're waking up from their football slumber. They're only watching the last month of the season here. So can't blame them, but the early part of the season mattered too. Obviously, January and February mattered quite a bit as well. And thus we have our potential field of 68 right now, which, by the way, pre-games today was tweeted by the field of 68. And we will be tweeting a fresh bracket after the show as well. Keep you guys updated going into Selection Sunday. Let's start off the show with our 1 seed discussion, fellas. And I think we've narrowed it down to maybe 6 teams or so that have potential to get that 1 seed. Andy, I can start with you here. Give me your 1 seeds. Tell me what's changed in the past week or so for you as well.
Yeah, so for me, these are reflective of what I sent over this morning. So this doesn't take into account Auburn's loss. But I had Gonzaga, obviously, who's pretty much cemented themselves at this point, particularly with Baylor losing as the number 1 overall seed. Arizona slotted in at 2nd. Had Auburn 3rd coming into today. I think that likely changes, assuming that Kansas wins tonight, and then Baylor clinging to that last spot. And so really it is, as you said, down to these 4 plus Kentucky and Kansas, and it kind of becomes a question of, do Kansas and Kentucky win their respective conference tournaments? And if it is, it's probably those 2 in Arizona. And if they don't, Probably depends when they lose, and you might be looking at the Big 12 ending up with 2 1 seeds. I don't see any way that the SEC ends up with 2 1 seeds, and Baylor may survive in that regard, losing to Oklahoma and stay on the 1 line.
So, Rocco, I'll let you get your 1 seeds up here as well. But let me ask you, do you think Arizona is a lock to get a 1 seed? It seems to be that most people assume Baylor, Auburn, Kentucky, Kansas are the ones kind of playing merry-go-round based on how Kansas and Kentucky end up doing in the SEC tournament. What are your thoughts? And let's also get your 1 seeds on the board.
Yeah, it's hard to say they're a lock. I think it would be down to Arizona and Baylor in the scenario where Kentucky chops down the nets in the SEC and Kansas cuts down the nets in the Big 12. So let's say that happens. They take 2 of the 1 seeds. Now it's probably Baylor or Arizona for the 4th. Because a loss today for Arizona, for example, is a loss to Colorado, non-tournament team, second loss to the Buffaloes if that happens. If they win that game, then they're going to play UCLA or USC. They're probably sitting pretty because they can afford to lose that game, and it's a tournament caliber opponent. So I think that's where Arizona sits. In terms of my order, I agree with Andy on the top 2, Gonzaga, Arizona. I did keep Baylor in the 3rd spot for now. Again, a team that we've talked about in the past with just an abundance of wins, 10 against the field, even still. I know yesterday's loss was a team not in the tournament field on a neutral court, but this morning Oklahoma woke up and they were a top 40 team in the net. So it is actually stacking up in the 1A column, even though it's a little bit fraudulent because I don't believe Oklahoma is a tournament team. But anyway, I think Baylor still belongs there in that 3rd spot for now. But I do think Kansas can overtake them by winning the Big 12 tournament. That means something to the committee. And then I also think Kentucky's right there if they keep winning in the SEC tournament to overtake Baylor. So a lot still to be decided. And the good news for Kentucky and Kansas is they're still playing.
Yeah. And worth noting, right, I've seen a lot of people assume Baylor is off that 1 line with that loss. They're one of 3 teams with Gonzaga and Kansas to have 10 Q1 wins. That's tops in the country. That matters. And Baylor's looked incredible this entire season. Maybe the LJ Cryer injury comes into play. I know the committee has thought about injuries going forward in the past. It seems to be kind of a dicey situation. I know a team like Creighton might be concerned about that with Ryan Nimhard injured, but I think that gets to be a little bit too narrow, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think in both those scenarios, they've shown without those guys that they've been able to beat quality teams as well. I think Creighton was potentially in some danger if they had really stumbled down the stretch without him, but beating Marquette again helps their case. And then the way Baylor played at the end of the Big 12 season yesterday, notwithstanding, I think showed that they can still beat people with their current their roster as it sits today. So I think it probably helped to quell some of those kind of fears.
That's a good point. Creighton probably exonerated themselves by getting those wins. Let's go to the bubble because there's always more intrigue around here. Let's start with the last 4 in. So Rocco, give me your last 4 in. I'm sure we're going to have quite a deep dive on these teams as well as Andy's.
Yeah, so on mine, we're going with up to the 2nd. And so, take it with a grain of salt. There still has to be a fresh set of numbers rolled out overnight and some due diligence done early tomorrow morning / tonight. But the way it stands today in this moment, my last 4 in are starting with Wyoming, followed by VCU, then the SMU Mustangs. And I did have North Texas above Notre Dame this morning. I know they lost to Louisiana Tech, team ranked number 101 in the net on a neutral floor. But without kind of being able to compare more than what I know right now, I would still keep North Texas just barely above Notre Dame, and they're eating up that last spot. But that's where we're at.
Interesting in North Texas. I think that was also a question many had. I know teams trying to get into the field have had, is North Texas going to take my bid? Is Conference USA now a bid stealer that they're out of that tournament? Andy, let's go to your last 4 in here, then we can discuss a little bit.
Yeah, so mine are less up to the minute. These are the ones I sent in earlier. I was, lost in the euphoria of the IU win and the subsequent postgame show. I didn't really have a lot of time to update things. So I've got Xavier, SMU, IU, and Notre Dame. I think obviously only one of these has played so far today, and IU certainly helped itself. I don't know that I would go so far as to say they've even moved their way out of last 4 in without really going through and looking at everything. Xavier is in the uncomfortable position of sitting and having to wait. I think the thing that, again, kind of going back to the things the committee says that various teams are hoping they're not lying about would be the lack of emphasis on the last 10 to 12 games. At Xavier, I think if they hang their hat on that, they've got 9 quad 1 and 2 wins, which compares pretty favorably to other teams around them on the bubble. And Notre Dame is kind of the opposite end of that. I've seen some people suggest they're relatively safe, and I struggle to see it. When you look, they have that Kentucky win, they won at Miami, and they beat North Carolina at home, and that's pretty much it. They've got 4 wins in the top 2 quadrants, and the strength of schedule is good. The non-conference strength of schedule is good, but just in terms of you look at wins against the field, any of those kinds of things, just depth of quality wins. Part of that is a function of the ACC, but I could very easily see them getting left out, and it sounds like Rocco has them right around the same area of the list that I do.
Yeah, the ACC in general, the resumes not great. Even Miami, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, Notre Dame, going to be a lot of intrigue surrounding that conference as we find out the field on Selection Sunday. Let's go to the first 4 out, I suppose, first, and then I want to get a full bubble picture. I don't want to step on anyone's toes here. So, Andy, I'm going to zigzag back to you and have you give us your first 4 out and let us know what maybe has changed. I know you said these weren't up to minute because you were, of course, celebrating your Indiana Hoosiers. Understandable. I would be too. So give us your first 4 out.
Yeah, so here, this is where you got a lot of teams, like Rocco said, about the good thing about Kansas and Kentucky is that they're still playing. And I think some of the challenges with a lot of these teams that are right around the cut line is they're in wait and see mode, unfortunately. So you've got Wake, who falls in that category. I think ultimately their non-conference strength of schedule is their undoing. They fall into a lot of the same traps as Notre Dame in a sense in terms of not having a high number of quality wins. I got VCU in that mix. They are still playing, so I think that helps as you look forward to a potential matchup between them and Dayton tomorrow. That becomes a really important game for both teams, assuming they both get there. And VCU, I think, has been a struggle in a lot of ways to really kind of assess what to make of them. You got the Ace Baldwin situation. They've got really good, they've got some solid metrics. But if you look at, wins against the field, they don't stack up very well in that regard. And that is a function of the A-10 as much as anything. You've got Oklahoma, who, the Baylor win is huge. They were kind of left for dead, I think at 14-14 and have kept themselves alive by winning 4 straight. I think they do need to beat Texas Tech tonight to really make a more compelling case, because otherwise they fall to 18-15. They get into a little bit of the 3 games over 500 discussion that Michigan is. And then I had BYU in the last spot. I think Virginia Tech was kind of right there in my write-up this morning. I did a first 5 out. BYU, a team that's been sitting idle for a while, and just kind of has fallen further and further down as different people have played. So not really sure it's realistic that they would make it. They do have 7 wins in quad 1 and quad 2, but metrics wise, they've kind of taken a dip in both the quality and resume metrics.
Yeah, VCU, I know there's some split opinions amongst the 4 esteemed bracketologists in the field of 68. Definitely an interesting case study there. And I know a lot of teams are watching that A-10 tournament with intrigue. We'll touch on that at the end of the show, but definitely rooting against SLU, I would say, the teams that are right on the bubble. Rocco, your first 4 out. What do you got?
First 4 out right this minute, Kai. Notre Dame, Xavier, Virginia Tech, and Dayton. The 2 tough ones today were Notre Dame and Xavier. So Xavier lost 2 days ago in overtime to Butler, and doing the whole comparison with the rest of the bubble, I had them yesterday as the last team in. And then, of course, Notre Dame fell yesterday. So I had to compare those 2. And I think the difference between Notre Dame and Xavier is really, really difficult. There's so much to poke at. I do like Notre Dame just a tad bit higher because, and I'm not even one that really likes home wins, but a win over Kentucky does mean something. It's a probable or possible number 1 seed. It's something that Xavier doesn't even come close to having. Xavier does have more wins against the field, but 4 of those 5 are at home, and their road win was at Creighton, who's back half of the at-large field. So it's not like they're a top 8 seed or anything. So Notre Dame can kind of ride on that, and that keeps them pretty interesting. And so those are my first 2. The problem with both of those, like Andy just alluded to, they're done. So they're just watching all these other teams play, whereas Virginia Tech, Dayton still got life in front of them. Virginia Tech has great opportunities with Carolina and potentially Duke if they can beat Carolina. Even if it's not Duke, they get Miami, which would still be two tournament caliber teams. So they start to get more and more interesting each time they beat a tournament team. But however, they, much like Xavier, haven't beat a high-end tournament team yet. They have 2 wins over Notre Dame. I think they have a win over Miami, and they haven't beat anybody on the top half of the board. And then Dayton, they're riding that Kansas win. They obviously have all that bad from the beginning of the year. It's kind of the same situation they've been in. They need to make a run in the A-10 tournament.
Notre Dame is reminding me of 2012 Washington, where that team won the Pac-12 regular season title, 14-4 in conference play. We see Notre Dame 15-5 in the ACC. To not make the field is just wow. But resume stacks up. Andy, I want to touch on Dayton with you. Not in your first 4 out. I assume they're in their next 4. And are they there because of those 3 eyesore losses that they racked up during the non-conference portion?
Yeah, that's really the biggest part of it for me. That's among the bigger blemishes. I think the other thing is you look, they've got the Kansas win. They do have the Miami win. That one helps a bit as well. They've got 3 wins versus the field the way that I looked at it. Plus they've beaten Virginia Tech, which helps for those purposes. Virginia Tech's an interesting one. They're kind of there themselves, but I think they've been propped up in some ways as good wins for other teams, because I think Xavier beat them as well, if I'm remembering correctly. So they've helped everybody else because their metrics are so good, and now they've kind of wiggled their way into the conversation. But yeah, to me with Dayton, I think they beating UMass in a game that I think just tipped off not very long ago doesn't really do anything. But if they're able to play VCU, beat them again tomorrow to get to the A-10 final, then maybe things get interesting there. But I think they've got to at least do that, and probably in reality need to get the auto bid.
On the head-to-head note, does that come into play often with the committee, especially around the bubble, if they see 2 teams have played each other and one's beaten the other? And I know I always see people tweeting about, oh, this team beat that team, how can they be seated higher? Does the committee give that much credence, or do they even think about that?
They alluded to it on the early reveal this year when they were talking about Kentucky and Kansas, and the message from the committee chair was essentially that if they're right next to each other on the seed list, then they would look at it more than they might otherwise do. So like I'll use an example this morning. So I had IU and Notre Dame basically as my last 2 in. IU beat them on a neutral floor. I think that's the other part, that it matters a little bit of where it was. I think if it's on a neutral floor, or if one at the other one, then that becomes a little more important than if you beat somebody at home. I don't know that that's maybe a fair tiebreaker, especially with some of the unbalanced schedules. So that's what the committee said. So again, that's the way that I tend to approach it. But there's also circumstances in some of those games, depending upon if certain guys didn't play and different things like that to consider. But that's the biggest part that I would add to that. I don't know if Rocco would add anything different, but
Andy, I like that response. Because typically for me, I don't look at it too much unless if it's a conference opponent and they swept them, then it's a little tougher to put them above if all other things are equal. But most of the time, I think the thing for the fans to know is that most of the time, not all other things are equal. There's usually another more important component that puts a team above another team. But just recently I had a comparison where Villanova and Purdue, for example, we're looking at the last number 2 seed, and they did play on a neutral court, and Purdue won that game. So for a day or 2, I had Purdue win that comparison. It had a little to do with the head-to-head, but there was a lot more that went into it. So again, nothing's ever due to one reason or another. It's always everything considered, and then you make your best decision on what you think the committee would decide.
I think I'm getting a little bit of a pause in my stream here, guys. I apologize.
I just heard it. All right. Well, here we'll wait till Kai gets back. Let's talk Texas A&M, because they're like the bubble darling of the moment. I would say, with beating Auburn today. I guess Rocco, I'll kind of throw it to you first. Like this is definitely a. Did you get caught up in the excitement of championship week and all of a sudden rocket A&M up your seed list when nobody was talking about them very long ago? So what's your read on them so far?
Yeah, good question, Andy. So Texas A&M, right now they've played 12 games against tournament caliber teams. They're 4-8. The wins are kind of sexy. You have the win at Alabama on the road, which is good to get one on a true road game. Of course, Auburn's on a neutral court, the one from today. They also picked up a home win over Arkansas and a neutral win over Notre Dame. The quadrant game, of course, is hurting them. 8-9 only against the top two quads, 13-11 against the top three. And then you have the home loss to Missouri, which is bad, and a home loss to South Carolina. Their overall resume metric, the KPI I don't think has updated, but I did notice the strength of record went from 57 to 48 after that game ended. So that was once you're in the 40s, I think you have to look at Texas A&M closely. For what I can tell, compared to the other options out there, they're still probably about the fifth team out for me, maybe the sixth team out. So again, if they lose tomorrow, nothing's going to improve. So I still can't see them getting there. And then if they win tomorrow, they're one win away from a bid steal. So for me, that's where they're at. I don't think they're quite up to like Notre Dame and Xavier level yet.
Yeah, interestingly, Notre Dame's another one. If you look at going back to what we were just talking about, A&M's got that win over them again on a neutral floor earlier in the season. So, yeah, a lot of these ACC teams have not done themselves any favors in the potential tiebreaker department for sure. I would argue they haven't done themselves many favors in a lot of ways, but that is certainly among them. So, Kai, I think you're back with us. I'll turn the reins back to you.
Guys, I'm sorry. Technical difficulties, man. That's on my end. Appreciate you guys taking over the show there. Yeah, Texas A&M, that was the one team that I've seen the most intrigue about, or at least the most speculation of people assuming they're in just because of those two wins. Now, let's remember, they didn't really get there in the other part of the season, but they still could, right, with a win over Arkansas. But obviously they would if they won the championship. But how about real quick, Rocco, going back, because I wanted to touch on Wake Forest. I didn't notice them in your first four out. Are they safely in your field above your bubble, or are they in your next four out?
Yeah, Kai, they just keep slipping down the list. I mean, I just don't see a reason to select them. You're talking about a team that's only beaten two teams against the projected field. Both of those games happened in Winston-Salem. You had 4 losses against teams that aren't in the projected field. You had 10 or 11 quad 4 games that you can pretty much throw away. And after that, you don't have a whole lot to work with. And you want to throw like a kicker on top. And by the way, I love Steve Forbes. I love Wake Forest fans. I have friends that went there. So again, this is me, the bracketologist talking. The kicker on top is the 338th ranked out of conference schedule. There's zero precedent for a team this close to the cut line to get selected. And I've said that on almost all these shows going back to January, that Wake Forest was in this danger if they, took another loss to a non-tourney team. They kind of need to float along until they lost to Duke or something in that tournament. And that BC loss really did them in. There's just better options now. And I can't see the committee putting them in at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. I equate them a little bit to IU in a certain regard, and I think the scheduling is not good for either one, and I'm not so sure that it wasn't for similar reasons in terms of you've got, Forbes is not in his first year, but you're still just trying to kind of build the program and grow it, and you scheduled it in a way that would allow you to get wins. And in his case, I think the team ends up being a lot better than what you might have thought it would be, and maybe you wish in retrospect that you had a team that you would have scheduled more aggressively for, but didn't. I think IU is the same way. They're year one of Woodson, trying to get some wins under their belt, hoping they can get to a point where they can get into the tournament. Some of the teams they scheduled in the non-conference out, weren't as good as what they thought they would be, and then you kind of get left here with that being used against you. But I would agree on Wake. I think that is kind of the nail in the coffin. Unfortunately, whatever the motivation was for it to be that way. And then you start looking at resume metrics are really not very good, as they've really fallen off. The quality metrics are pretty solid, but that doesn't help you a whole lot from a selection perspective, given where they are. And then as you look at those, got one win against a team that's firmly in the field in North Carolina, and then otherwise you got Notre Dame, who's right around the cut line that you beat at home, and then you won at Virginia Tech, who neither of us have in either. And then after that, the next best win's at Virginia, who got run off the floor by Carolina last night. So, I just think the more you look at theirs compared to others on the bubble, the worse it looks. Offhand,
do you know the at-large team with the highest non-con strength of schedule that's gotten in the field?
I can tell you last year, Drake got in with 306. And that's the first one I've noticed over 300. But I also think it's because they weren't a power conference and they took into consideration that Drake was this team that, only had so many teams that would take a game against them. And they had this crazy, where they start 17-0 start or something. So, and they had they only had 8 games in the first 2 quads and they went 6-2. So the cool thing I like about the recent committees is that they took that Drake team. And again, I'm speaking from the mid-major level here. And they took that Belmont team in 2019, who also had, some nice wins for the chances they had. And, so if North Texas gets in this year, for example, I think they're going to have to really appreciate that road record. They're the last team standing undefeated, went all the way to the last day of the season until they lost at UTEP. They almost ran the table on the road, which is very impossible to do historically in a league like Conference USA, which stretches all the way from El Paso, Texas, to Huntington, West Virginia. And so I have so much respect for what they did. And maybe that's part of why I might miss on North Texas. But, if there's a voice like mine in the room, they've got a shot.
Yeah. I've always wondered if they should switch to like sort of a batting average type of approach with the Q1, Q2 wins instead of just, North Carolina had 20 chances to win against Q1, Q2. Of course they had 5 or 6 Q1, Q2 wins, but always a topic of debate. 2 teams I want to talk about, speaking of mid-majors, Murray State and Loyola. We know they're in the field now. They won their conference tournaments. How do we seed these teams? And my question kind of stems from their quality metrics are very good, very, very good. But like we just kind of talked about, the number of quality wins they have, not as high as I would say most teams in the 7 to 10 range, maybe even 6 range. I don't know where you guys quite have them. But Andy, I'll go to you first. Where do you slot Murray and Loyola? How high do you think potentially they could get if you were the committee?
I've got Murray State as a 7 right now. I feel like that's probably the ceiling for them at this point. I guess maybe enough teams lose in front of them, but I have them toward the low end of the 7 line. I feel like they're either the last 7 or the next to last. So I just don't know that they're going to get there. The resume metrics are pretty solid. The quality metrics are, outside of Sagarin are really good. And so I think they're, 5-1 against the top 2 quadrants. But I think, they were able to win at Memphis, won at Belmont. I think they tried to schedule as well as they could. But I think ultimately that they probably end up in that 7. I think a 6 is probably the best they could do. But I know I've seen some people who have them as a 8-9, which I think is a little bit Loyola-esque of last year, potentially. And then Loyola, I think they're I have them as a 10. I think they're probably somewhere between the 9 to 11 range, depending upon what you think. I don't see them getting any higher than that, just given some of the losses that they took in the league. And really, although they played great in Arch Madness, they had a losing record against the other top 3 teams in the league heading into that. So, but I think some of the quality metrics, I think the name carries a little bit of weight because of what they've done in the past, right or wrong. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking they're in that 9 to 11 range, probably more likely a 10-ish.
And Rocco, where do you see those 2 teams? And for Murray, is that 30-2 record? Is that doing a lot of heavy lifting? Because obviously that jumps off the page.
Well, it does. It really does. There's been some precedent of that. Murray State themselves, I think 10 years ago or so, when they had Isaiah Canyon, they got a 6 seed. And I think they were 29-1 that year. So they almost ran the table. I think I'm very similar to Andy's answer. Murray State's sitting right there in the 7 slot for me. That win at Memphis is just aged like a fine wine. And if Memphis goes on and wins the American, I don't know. Who knows what the net will do? Maybe they'll pop into the top 20. Maybe you'll look at them again and they sneak into a 6. But again, most of those teams have already lost. Like right now, Ohio State already lost and fell below them. Alabama is already out, staying above them. And I actually moved Colorado State up to a 6 today above Murray because they're still winning. They're building on their resume. Those Mountain West games are meaningful. They add something to your overall picture. So I definitely agree there with Andy on the 7 spot. They're probably most likely stuck. And then Loyola Chicago, 9 to 11 makes perfect sense to me. I actually moved them from an 11 to 10. I just keep looking over and over again because, in this part of the bracket last year, the committee, these teams are pretty solidly in. Once you're in that 9 to 10 or 8 range, I think they're looking a little heavier at the predictive, and that actually favors the Ramblers. They're sitting at 23 in KenPom, 24 BPI, 35 Sagarin. So I think the problem is their resume is actually like closer to 50th. So they have the opposite problem as most mid majors. And so it'll be interesting to see where they land. This is one where you could, I don't really like to do this with very many teams, but I know Lucas loves doing it, and he's pretty darn good. You take all 5 of them, you throw them in a blender, and you divide them by 5. They probably land at a 10 seed. Is I think where it comes out to. So,
yeah, and I want to talk about Colorado State as well. One of you mentioned their BPI, and we talked about this in past shows, is ridiculously high compared to the other 2 metrics and quality. Do you throw that out if you're the committee? Do you average it? It's clearly an outlier, and you look at their wins, their resume, it seems strange. What do you do with that, Rocco?
Yeah, it's funny. I was with the coaches yesterday, so I talked to them about it, and they're like asking me to reassure them that that's going to be an outlier. I look at it as an outlier. Andy, I think you probably do too. So you would hope that the committee does. There's no guarantees. It's on the team sheet for some reason. But this is the good news for Colorado State, I think, is that this happened to basically every Mountain West team that's in the running. And it also happened to BYU. It happened to Creighton. You can find a few more examples out there. So it's an outlier for not just Colorado State. So you would ideally think they've got 2 other ones to look at. They've got a great resume to look at. I mean, Colorado State's got a real nice resume. And they're building on it still. They're still alive. So that gave me enough confidence to move them from a 7 to a 6. But I think, if it depends on how they interpret the information. And we have no earthly idea how they're going to do that. Some of these people are basketball people. Some of these people are just getting introduced to the process for the first time. And who knows who holds all the cards in the room are. So It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at it, you've got kind of 3 different levels when you look at those metrics. You got San Diego State, who is loved equally by all the quality metrics, and they're like they are actually the outlier of the league in that regard. And then Boise and Colorado State look pretty similar, where pretty strong in KenPom and in Sagarin, and then BPI is the outlier. And then Wyoming is a little bit interesting, and this is probably why Rocco had them in his last 4 in. Their BPI is over 100. It's 102, at least it was as of this morning. But their Sagarin is also 82. So there's at least, like, if you're looking at the, 2 of the 3, those skew a little bit higher. And so maybe it's less of an outlier in that scenario. So it's just kind of interesting to look at those teams who have, from a conference perspective, played pretty similar schedules, but how the metrics have interpreted them all differently. So if I'm Boise and Colorado, I feel pretty good that, hey, everything else says I'm in great shape, except this one. If I'm Wyoming, while I still think they're relatively safe, there's at least another data point out there that suggests maybe you're not quite as safe as you think you are.
Right. A couple notes in the chat here. Marquette discussion. They do seem to be kind of falling down the seed line a little bit, seed list a little bit. I would think an 8 or 9 seed is about where they top out or bottom out, I would say, especially since their season is over. Rocco, fair to say Marquette 8 or 9, you're pretty safe there?
Yeah, I mean, I could see them slipping to like a high 10. I have as my last 9 today, but they're safely in the field. So that's good news for Golden Eagle fans. They swept Villanova and they had some other great wins, but the prospects of winning in the tournament are not looking good. They really did falter down the stretch. So I'd be concerned there. And it's no fun being in an 8-9 game either, knowing that if you win, you're probably in real trouble in the second game. But yeah, I think that's fair. I actually can't see them being an 8 anymore. I like a lot of the teams above them now, but who knows? Like some of these 8-9s are very tough to predict historically.
Yeah. Andy, 8 or 9 for you?
Yeah, I've got them as a 9. I might have them a spot or 2 higher. I think they were either my first or second 9 coming into today. But again, as a team that's idle, you're going to have a tough time climbing back up the list. But they do have, the Villanova when you talked about, they got 10 in the first 2 quadrants. That's helpful. No Q3, Q4 losses unless anything shifts around. So they're in kind of safe shape, but yeah, it's almost like you'd almost rather slip to a 10. You might give yourself a better chance to actually advance if you can start playing a little bit better. But I think 9 is probably the most likely seed for them.
And we kind of touched on it at the beginning of the show, but Ben asks, if Kentucky and Kansas don't win their conferences, who are the 2 other 1 seeds? And Andy, would that be status quo for you? Auburn, Baylor, Arizona, Gonzaga keep their 1 seeds?
I think Baylor probably stands to benefit the most from that scenario. I think at that point it becomes. I'm going to assume with that question that Arizona stays there. I think if Arizona wins tonight, then they're pretty safe. I think Baylor probably benefits the most, and then it kind of comes down to a look at Kansas, Kentucky, Auburn, and I think it may matter just how far Kansas and Kentucky go in their respective tournament. So, not winning could be losing today, but not winning could also be getting to the final and losing, in which case maybe that's there. So if as an example, Kansas gets knocked out today and Kentucky goes to the final, we can share our thoughts on what the Sunday afternoon tournaments actually mean. But I think in that scenario, Kentucky probably feels pretty good, win or lose, based on having gotten there. So I think it matters a little bit how deep they go. But Baylor, I think, is the ultimate beneficiary if they both lose, because they're kind of ahead of one or both of them today on most lists.
Yeah, I think Rocco and I talked about it last week, that those Sunday afternoon games, they kind of mean jack for for the tournament, unless they're teams that are actually stealing bids, right? Yeah.
Yep.
One team that's not in the chat, but I just kind of want to spring on you guys because I look at their resume and I keep wondering, man, should I have them higher? And that's St. Mary's, a team that has only losses in Q1. They have 4 Q1 wins. Their quality metrics are very, very good. Their resume metrics are very good. Is it crazy to think St. Mary's might go to a 5 seed, or do you think that's a bridge too far? Start with Rocco.
I moved the Gales to a 5 earlier this week, and a lot of the reasons why you said, they had a winning record on the road. They didn't have anything elite on the road. They won on the hilltop against the Dons, neutral win over Notre Dame. But obviously, you get that. There's only a few teams you can beat at home where it really makes a huge punch, and of course, Gonzaga is one of those teams. Kind of like with Notre Dame beating Kentucky at home, it still stands out a little bit because how good that team is. And not only that, but I was at St. Mary's versus Gonzaga both last week and this week, and they can hang, and that's a dangerous team. And I know they're not excited to play in a 5-12, but it's, I guess, better than a 6-11. Right. And I think LSU lost today. That was the team I was looking at who should be the last 5. And with LSU losing today, I feel a lot more solid that St. Mary's is going to, in fact, be a 5.
Andy, your opinion on the Gales?
Yeah, I forget because I'm not even sure I know what day it actually is at this point, but I've moved them to a 5 at some point in the last few days.
Exactly.
And so I think that I think they should feel pretty good. They're really across the board. The metrics they're right around 20th in virtually everything. So you kind of look at where that lands you from a seeding perspective, and it's there. No losses outside of Q1. Their non-conference strength of schedule is good. So really a lot to like. Plus that Gonzaga win, as Rocco mentioned, carries a ton of weight at this point, because it was mentioned in the reveal that Duke was where they were at that point because of having beaten Gonzaga and Kentucky, and so if it holds weight for them, it should hold the same weight for St. Mary's.
Good to hear. I love the Gales this year, man. They're a tough team. A couple games to watch, obviously, this weekend. Well, I'm looking at conferences that can steal bids, and the A10 is one that jumps off the page. We know VCU is not safe. We know Davidson. Is Davidson safe? If they go down in these semis, are they a safe bid to make the dance stills and at large? Bubble teams obviously don't want SLU to make it to the title game, or rather, I'll frame that differently. They do want SLU to make it to the title game. They want SLU to lose in the title game. So Rocco, give me a little A10 scenario here. I'll start with Davidson. Are they in if they lose? And then, no, let's just go with that. Let's start with that.
Yeah, I think Davidson's in if they lose at this point. I think, they've done road damage, and the committee loves road damage. We love road damage. Winning in Birmingham and Alabama matters. Winning your league matters, and they've got that regular season championship that will go on the resume. And they picked up a lot of solid road wins throughout the conference season. So it's a little different than Wyoming. Wyoming's a team, and I'm comparing them to them because Wyoming's in my first 4 out. Where would Davidson slip with a loss to SLU, for example? Wyoming's a team that's got their 2 tournament wins at home. They don't have a road win against a team in the field unless they beat, or even a neutral win, but they could beat Boise today and get one. So we'll see how that goes. But for now, I look at Davidson, and I think they've done so much good, and they've got that championship. There's really no reason to hold them out at all. And then in terms of the rest of go ahead.
I was saying go Davidson then if you're a team outside of the A-10.
Yeah, root for Davidson, no question. And then on the other side of the bracket, you mentioned it earlier, it's all about VCU and Dayton because they still have at-large aspirations. Richmond's a team, Kai, you guys have been talking about them for years, full of veterans. When are they ever going to wake up? Maybe, are they going to finally show up? And, so maybe they're a team to watch as a potential bid stealer. We know SLU's got talent. Cannot envision UMass winning this thing. Sorry, Minutemen.
Yeah.
But I like their inspirational videos after the wins, the locker room celebrations last couple games. So it's been fun. But yeah, Dayton, VCU, Richmond, St. Louis, Davidson, the A-10 tournament, like any of those five could realistically cut down the nets.
Yeah, I agree with you. Andy, I'm going to close the show with feeding you 2 Big Ten questions, but I'll let Rocco hop in too if he has some opinions here. So one in the chat, Jim asks, Jim Wick, is Michigan comfortably in? We talked about the 3 wins over 500, bugaboo on their record right now. So question 1. And then question 2, let's talk about Rutgers, a team that's gotten a lot of attention. They just went down to Iowa today. Are their quality wins, the number of which are massive, I would say, for a bubble team? Is that enough to get them in the field?
Yeah, with Michigan, they're an interesting case. It feels like, and I didn't have them there this morning, in large part kind of waiting to see what other results there would be, but it feels like they trend to me toward ending up in Dayton. I feel like Dayton is hey, we're going to give you a shot and put you in the field, but we have questions place that the committee goes to. And so I think when you look at Michigan, you look at the 3 games over 500 thing, I think you throw out last year in terms of how that worked with scheduling and COVID and all the things that encompass that. But Michigan, from a metric standpoint, is as good or better as most any bubble team that's really in the mix for one of the last handful of spots. And I know the group of us was exchanging some texts last night. There's probably 5 to 6 spots really left for, I don't know, maybe 11, 12-ish teams. Michigan's got as good a metrics as anybody in there, and they've got some solid quality wins. So I think they probably get in, but I don't know that they're – I think they end up in Dayton probably when it's all said and done. Rutgers is interesting. They're one that I really struggled with this morning for sure. I ended up with them in my field based on their wins, but the more and more you look at it, so many things about them would be unprecedented. Now, the flip side is it's pretty hard to rack up the kinds of wins that they have and still have metrics as poor as theirs are. Right. So perhaps that is also unprecedented, and it becomes a little bit hard to really gauge that. But I think, they scored a few late baskets today, but Iowa, from an efficiency standpoint, was pretty good on them. I think they drop in the net even further than they already were, so they probably dip close to 80 when it's all said and done. And I just that feels like a bridge too far in the long run there. I think they end up getting passed by people, and kind of crazy given the wins that they've had, and they basically had one bad week that's going to keep them out of the tournament. But it seems to be trending in that direction. I thought today's game was a pretty big one for them.
Rocco, your Michigan Rutgers thoughts?
Yeah, pretty close to Andy on Michigan. I thought they had done enough coming into the week when they won at Ohio State to close out the weekend last weekend. It's another great road win for Michigan, but they're in this situation where their criteria is a little different than most bubble teams. 28 contests outside of Q4, it's a lot of data, and they go 14-14. So, you could see them being excluded even. I mean, that would be very controversial because I think the highest net team so far in our couple of years of history to get left out was number 36. They're sitting at 34, so they would break that record if they got left out. But I tend to agree with Andy. Dayton does make sense because, we've been dealing with this Rutgers, Indiana, Michigan saga for weeks. And if they somehow put all 3 in, so I think one of them's got to go to Dayton. And I don't want to send Rutgers or Indiana to Dayton because that would also be unprecedented for a power conference team with a 300-plus non-conference to go to Dayton. They usually go well above the cut line. So Michigan would be the only team that kind of fits the narrative there and the history. Not that the new committee particularly cares or not, but it seems to always kind of hold true. And then on the Rutgers side, I also agree with Andy. I've been thinking about them more and more. I thought they were pretty close to a lock coming in. They're a double bye team and a loaded Big Ten. But you look at the numbers, and the numbers kind of speak for themselves. I think they will land around 80 tomorrow morning in the net. Yeah, they lost by 10 today on a neutral. The The good news for Rutgers actually is that Indiana probably played their way into the field. So now they have 2 road wins over the field instead of just the Wisconsin win. So that helps there. I can see the room being very, very split on them. But I think, another thing that kind of knocked Wake Forest out to a lesser extent could knock Rutgers out, being number 300 in non-conference strength of schedule as a power conference team.
Yeah. Lots to look for over the next couple of days here. Tomorrow is another fantastic day of hoops. There's still a bunch left today. That does it for us, though. That's our time. Appreciate you guys joining us out there. Reminder, the Field of 68 will tweet a full seed list of the bracketologists at the Field of 68's consensus Field of 68. That's a lot of Field of 68s. But stay tuned. These guys are the most accurate bracketologists in the world. They're going to be right. Selection Sunday is only 2 days away. Thanks for joining us. Follow the Field of 68 on Twitter. We will see you next week on a different show.